all the nation states that were conquered began to Hellenize. Hellenize means to become like the Greeks. And so we see they adopted the Greek language, the Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek science, which is the same as a philosophy, Greek religion, which is paganism, with the temples, the oracles, and the coming mystery religion, the mysterion. They accepted all of these. And even nation states, city states that were not conquered, what happened to them? They said, I want to be like these guys, right? And so guess what they did? They started to Hellenize. Guess which nation state Hellenized like crazy? You know it. I gave it to you. Romanos. Rome. Do you ever, okay, anybody been to Rome? Okay, do the old Roman temples look like Greek temples? Is that an accident? What did the Romans speak and write when they wanted to be educated? Greek. What are their gods? They're all Greek gods, guys.
They just give them new names.
They just, well, and actually some aren't that new. Hestia Vesta. Well, my goodness. Sounds almost the same, right? The thing that's really amazing is, okay, we know about the Hellenized world. And the Hellenized world is what we're talking about. The Levant is Hellenized. The Hellenized from 300 BC, right? That's the period going up. Was it Hellenized during the time of the Gospels? Big time Hellenized. And guess who else was Hellenized? The Romans were Hellenized. And the Romans weren't conquered by the Greeks. This is really important for us to know. The whole world was Greek.
How could Alexander be fighting for what was 20 years or something like that, and have all of this come as that? There must have been something much more than war.
That's homework. As I said, the framework of Hebraic culture, the framework of the Apocryphas, as we talked about in the Apocrypha class, the framework of Hellenization made the Levant a perfect incubator for the rise of Christianity. And we have, as I said, we haven't even talked about the Mysterion, which is a critical aspect in understanding this, the rise of Christianity too. But the Gospels can only be understood within the context of this Hellenized world. And by the way, the Romans are Hellenized too. So, in any case, we have the generals, okay? He had 3 generals, Seculus, Ptolemy, and Anagonus. And when he died, they broke the world into 3 parts. So Seleucus took the Seleucid Empire, this part. Ptolemy took this part, which was Egypt. And Macedon was taken by Anagonus. So, this is the world. 3 different Hellenized empires that are Greek empires that are ruled by Greek leaders that had been generals of Alexander. And what happened is, remember I said war right across the Levant? So guess what these 3 guys were doing for the next 400 years, 300 years? Fighting, until, well, here's Socrates. And I want to mention this. The death of Socrates, the real change was a turning point of Greek culture, moving from paganism to mysterion. The big change, and I'll talk about this, so I'm not going to stick on this. I guess I didn't realize I had this segue, so this is good. The difference in Socrates and other Greek philosophers is that they did not focus their knowledge in religion. If you read Socratean stuff, it's not generally about religion specifically. It does talk about religious ideas and theology, but it's mostly about philosophy. And so this is a step toward mystery religion, or mysterion. The focus on a leader, the revelation of a mystery, the initiation rites, the step of knowledge to full revelation leads directly to Gnosticism, which, by the way, Gnosticism is an outgrowth of Christianity, which is very interesting, and a separation from physical revelation. Now, and I'll just mention this really shortly, but if you are, for example, in a mysterion in the Greek period, you name your mysterion after either your god or your leader. So if it's Pythagoras was the creator of your mysterion, you named yourself the Pythagorean mysterion. By the way, their mystery was the Pythagorean theorem. Osirian mystery is Pi, Osiris, right? So Christ's mysterion,
It's Christianity.
Christian. And the mystery of faith, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Christianity is not a mysterion. But remember in Acts it said in Antioch, who first called the Christians Christians? The Greeks. Yeah. Did the Christians call themselves Christians?
No.
No, because why?
They were the way.
Well, yeah, they were teen hodos. That's exactly right. They were called teen hodos in Acts. They're called teen hodos. They're rarely called Christians. The Greeks called them Christians because they looked like a mysterion. And if you were a Christian in the 1st or 2nd century, there's no way you want to be called Christian. Because that was like a curse. That meant you were like a mysterion. And actually Paul, we're going to find this out in the Gospels, and Paul encouraged have Christianity look like a mysterion, because that way you could infiltrate. That's why, what is December 25th? Whose birthday is really December 25th?
There's something called Saturnalia.
No.
Mithras. Mithras' birthday. Mithras is the Mithrin mysterion. Easter was the original festival of Hestia. The word Easter comes from Hestia. Hestia was the original goddess of the festival around Easter. All of the Christian festivals are borrowed from either Jewish theology or from the Greeks and the Romans, because Christianity infiltrated them. It's really funny that today Halloween, which is a Christian holiday, is being lost because Christians, what? Oh, that's a secular thing. Well, it was a secular thing back in the antiquity too, but they infiltrated it. I'll talk more about this, but it's really funny because just like the name Kyrios, church. Church comes from Kyrios. Kyrios means literally Lord Mithras. Because Christian churches were originally infiltrated the Mithrin rituals, the Mithrin, and basically took over their things. And guess where the early churches, where all the early churches are? Underground. And guess where they built their first churches after they became a Legio Regitis under the Romans in about 350 AD? They built them on top. And most Orthodox churches, what do they have right underneath the sanctuary?
Oh, the crypts.
The crypts. The crypts, right? Because that is what the original churches in hiding. They weren't mysterions, they were in hiding. So remember, we had a class in the Ephesians where I talked about mysterion in great detail. I don't know if you were there, but you know, that's the point, is that the church basically infiltrated the Greek culture as a mysterion. And that's why one of the reasons it's so important to note this. Again, there is a framework here that's being laid, that has been laid in history, that has fruition suddenly within the context of the Gospels. Really the greatest addition was not this mystery religion or mysterion, but looking at the world from a position of rationalism. And that's Peshat versus Dirash. Now what is Peshat versus Dirash? I don't think I got to those slides last week, but if you remember Remez, Remez is the acronym that the Jewish scholars use for how the Jewish people or the rabbis understand Scripture, the Old Testament documents. And the Remez stands for Rimi, Peshat, Dirash, and Sod. So the four ways that the Jewish rabbis look at the Old Testament documents. And one of the ways they look at it is Peshat. Peshat is literal, but a literal look at the New Testament or at the Old Testament documents really didn't happen until around 600 to 1100 AD. Before that, they looked at them in a Dirash concept. And a Dirash concept literally means it's not literal. It means to look at it within a not allegorical, but rather an analogy sense. So everything that you read, that they read, they interpreted as a sermon, basically, as a homiletic understanding, not literal. So the worldview that the Hebrew worldview at the time was very much an irrational worldview, very similar to what the pagan worldview was. I'll talk more about that. But the big thing about the Greek worldview is it was changing from an irrational worldview to a rational worldview. From a pagan worldview where the gods made everything happen and fate made everything happen, where, for example, in the Gospels, what causes illness?
Sin.
Well, in the Hebrew worldview, sin, but what really caused illness in all the Gospels? Demons. Demons. You know, in the Greek worldview, I just finished teaching this part, but you have, you know, it says that, for example, Peter's mother-in-law had a purios, which means she was afflicted with Zeus's fire. So she was cursed by Zeus because they didn't, you know, in the ancient world they had no clue that, you know, fevers or illness was caused by viruses or bacteria, right? No idea. They thought you were either cursed by the gods or you had a demon within you, right? And so therefore the worldview was irrational. That's an irrational worldview. Christianity was the first group that stopped having that irrational worldview, which is how Western civilization comes into being. Because, for example, the Greeks, what did the Greeks do with ill people, sick people? They threw them in the Asclepion. The Asclepion is the temple to the god Asclepius. They did not treat people that were ill, that had sicknesses. They put you in the Asclepion. If you got better and walked home, you're okay. Where did Christians set up the first hospitals? In the Asclepions. Because they knew that the Greeks, you know, they would not be bothered there by the Romans or the Greeks. Because there were sick people there. There were people that were ill that were dying. And the Christians were the first to be in the Asclepions. And by the way, we know this because in Corinthians, remember Paul gives you some concrete examples. You know, you're the arm, the head, the shoulder, eyes. Guess what they were looking at in their Asclepion, in their synagogue, their Tenoda synagogue? The Greeks would bring models of the parts of their body that were afflicted into the Asclepions and put them in the Asclepions. You can find them in the Greek stuff. So if they had an afflicted elbow, they'd bring their elbow. They'd bring their arm, their hand. And so when Paul was giving them that concrete example in, I think it was Colossians 2, but also in definitely in 1 Corinthians, what was he alluding to? He was alluding to the models of the body parts that were there in the Asclepion. And we know this. Historically, we know that Christians met in the Asclepions because they were safe there.
They met to worship there?
Yep, they met to worship and to, you know, because they were kicked out of the synagogues. The Corinthian church was the first church kicked out of the synagogue. So they had to find some place to worship, and so where did they worship? The Asclepion. Because, you know, why would you go to a Asclepion unless you're dying, right? So, very interesting stuff. I talk about it in one of my books. In my books I talk about this stuff. In this period, we get logic, scientific method, and legal historical method. Legal historical method I'll talk about next week as we look at the veracity of the Gospels. This is how you prove history. This is how you prove science. This is how you prove basically mathematics, logic. I won't go into great detail here, but Greek rationalism is the basis for Western civilization and thought. And let's see. Here's the Romans. Okay, Roman Republic. 509 was established. The city-states in Rome were apart. They were not a world power until 200 BC. The First Punic War, they defeat Carthage. The Second Punic War, they defeat Hannibal, Carthage. Okay? Then they defeated Macedon. Macedon, why is that important? That's Anagonus Empire after Alexander. So they're eating away at the Greek Empire. They defeated Syria in 190. And then the Third Punic War, and that proves the effectiveness of war, whether you like it or not, because they salted the earth and killed every single one of them. And they probably had a good reason to. I don't have time to talk about it, but Carthage was finally razed, and they destroyed Carthage. Carthage is basically, remember the guys in the Old Testament that were called the, what are they called? The ones on the coast that were always bothering us. The Philistines. The Philistines are basically the same as the Carthaginians.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and same religion and same everything. They're also called the boat people. They're the ones that the Egyptians kicked out. I don't have. I've talked about it in some of these classes before. I don't have real time today. In 49 BC, which is the date I made my children memorize, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. That was the end